Hi, my name is Kasey, and I'm a believer in Jesus Christ who struggles with codependency, control, perfectionism, impulsivity, there's a lot, rage, and people-pleasing. I grew up in Fort Pierce, Florida, as the youngest of 4 children. My dad is an alcoholic, and my mom a codependent. I am an adult child of an alcoholic. As a child, I lived in fear of my father. I was scared of him and his explosive anger. I even remember fighting with my brother over who had to sit next to my dad at the dinner table because neither of us wanted to. I didn't have a strong relationship with my dad. He would come home from work, usually very angry, and I would peer out the bedroom door to see what mood he was in and decide to what degree I was going to avoid him for the evening. This is where I learned to walk on eggshells and check the temperature of the room. My dad would go sit out back and rarely talk to me. His alcoholism was a normal thing for our family. In fact, my dad would drive in the car with us kids with a drink in his hand, and my mom chose not to address it. So I wouldn't talk about it either. I didn't realize it was an issue until I was a freshman in college when I noticed other families weren't like mine. As a child, I was silly and outspoken. I loved to laugh and make jokes, and now thinking back, I recognize that I used humor to cut the pain of not feeling loved or accepted by others, especially my father. To cope with my pain of not being good enough, perfectionism became my drug. I had an insatiable drive to be perfect in everything I did, whether that was school, work, my jobs, or the arts. I was devastated if I got a B on a progress report or messed up at my job. This perfectionism, though delivered me great results for me in my education, however, it destroyed my personal self-esteem because I couldn't be perfect and I would fail others. I remember auditioning for a singing and dancing group at my school, and I didn't make it either. It was crushing to me, and the feelings of not being good enough continued to develop in my life. Fortunately, in the midst of my family's insanity, I grew up with a relationship with Jesus. Since I can remember, I've had a relationship with God. I went to church with my grandmother. She would bring me with her every Sunday, and I would go to children's church. She did this until she got remarried to the love of her life and moved away. After that, I asked my mom to bring me to church, and she obliged, and I went to church by myself as a 3rd grader every Sunday and every Wednesday. It was within the walls of that church that I learned the love of Jesus and his plan for my life. And I have great respect for teachers of children's ministry and student ministry because that was the season where God met me. I believe it was in this time that God was fostering a calling on my life to do ministry, and I had no idea. Unfortunately, this was also the season in my life where I learned, and unfortunately, this was the season in my life where I learned to also try to be the perfect Christian girl. I wore masks to hide my struggles and imperfections, and I didn't want anyone to know I wasn't perfect. We struggled financially most of my life, except for a stint when my dad won the lottery, but that's another story for another day. And I see this show up in my adulthood as my desire to control my finances is very prevalent in my life. I'm hyper vigilant of my money and want to do different things from what I experienced as a child. From my family of origin, I learned coping mechanisms and relationship pitfalls that soon became my rock bottom as an adult. In my last semester of college, I began a year-long internship at a church as a youth ministry intern. It was during this internship that God began to bring to light a lot of my pain that I experienced as a child and began to work in me. Due to this being my final semester at college, I needed a place to live. And the Lord provided with me the home of a church pastor and his family. I experienced acceptance and love in a way I had never really understood before. But going back to a family home setting reminded me of living with my dad and brought back those old habits like walking on eggshells. I would put myself to bed at night without saying goodnight to anyone to avoid any form of intimacy or love because I was so afraid of being rejected. The family I was living with recognized this, and the pastor had me give him high fives before bed every night to help me to become more comfortable. As my internship was complete, I moved to North Carolina to go to grad school. I hated it. The snow and the school just did not fit this Florida girl very well. I had a hard time connecting to a local church and was just generally unhappy. After one semester of seminary, I moved back to Florida and applied for some local youth ministry pastor jobs in the area. I was soon hired after that as the student ministry director. During this season, encouraged by a mentor, I went to counseling to work on some of my issues. I went to the library and legitimately rented every single book I could find on being an adult child of an alcoholic. I wiped the library clean. I was bound and determined to not be identified as an adult child. And while I began to acknowledge some of my issues, I had no idea that the Lord wanted to heal me of so much more. My first couple years as a youth pastor were great, but of course had a few bumps in the road. Although I loved my job, the students I worked with, and the families I got to know, my perfectionism caused great fears of inadequacy, self-loathing, self-doubt, and waves of, I love my job, I hate my job. I recognized I was often triggered anytime someone said they needed to talk to me, or when a parent was upset, or when a coworker didn't think I was lifting my weight. Anytime I wasn't perfect, it would send me into a spiral of depression and anxiety. I would find myself searching for jobs online as an escape from the fears I was experiencing. Fear that I wasn't a good enough leader, speaker, or friend ravaged my peace and bled into my relationships with others. And just like any good, unhealthy person, I decided to invite someone else into my mess. In my 4th year of student ministry, I met my then husband. I had such high expectations for my marriage. I wanted it to be perfect. My dreams and hopes came crashing to the floor when we weren't getting along. My marriage was incredibly unhealthy for so many reasons. We were having explosive fights. I would rage on my ex. When I wasn't able to control him, I would use words to tear him apart. The divorce word was used on more than one occasion and became paralyzing for me. I turned into a maniac at home, yet wore a really good mask at church. I felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It wasn't 3 months into the marriage before my ex called the pastor and told him about our struggles. I was at first furious with my ex for letting others know we were struggling. I wanted my life to look perfect, even if it was in shambles on the inside. I would go to church and everyone would ask how the newlyweds were, and I would just say it was great, even though I was absolutely miserable. I was trying to maintain this image of perfectionism, and I never realized how much I let the opinions of others control me. I couldn't bear the thought of being a failure in my marriage when I'm in ministry and I expected myself to hold it all together. At this time, I was a really good blamer. I blamed my ex-husband for all the issues in our broken marriage. I thought he needed to change. I decided the problem wasn't me, it was him. I was in complete denial. Eventually, my pastor, my ex, and I sat down and decided that I needed to step out of ministry for a few weeks to focus on healing. I shared with the students and the youth volunteers about my marriage struggles, which in turn left me feeling very exposed. This just made me want to wear a mask even more because I felt like everyone knew my shame secret. I was so embarrassed and I became very resentful. Every time I walked into church, people asked me about my marriage and I felt like I had a giant scarlet letter on my shirt and I was being judged. I really, really wanted to run. I felt like no one knew the whole story. After taking a few weeks off from ministry, I was so unhappy with where my life was at the time, I decided to step down from my job. This was one of the saddest decisions for me. I felt like a failure as a youth pastor, a wife, and a Christian. During this time, I received a text from Christine inviting me to celebrate recovery. I graciously ignored it, as I did not need Celebrate Recovery. I wasn't one of those people, and besides, I believed at the time I wasn't the problem and my ex was. But I now know differently, and I almost always have a part. My ex and I went on a trip, and when we got home from this trip, acting on the advice of a counselor, I packed my stuff, my cat, and I moved out. It was an impulsive move, and I've learned through the steps that impulsivity is one of my greatest character defects. Leaving my ex at the moment was a very difficult decision. And I left not because I wanted the marriage to be over, but because I wanted it to work, and what we were doing wasn't working. I was getting desperate for change. Truthfully, I wanted him to change, but I've learned through the steps that the only person I can change is myself. When I moved to a friend's home, one of the things I brought with me was a book about prayer that I had received from a friend. And I was willing to do whatever, so I began reading that book. Chapter 1 of this book hit me the hardest. One of the lines says, "It's not about who needs to change, it's about who's willing to change." And it was at that point that I decided I needed to change and I needed to do something different. That same morning, I received another text from Christine saying that she was praying for me. I took that as a clue from the Lord that recovery would probably help me. And to be honest, I had a lot of preconceived notions about CR. I thought I didn't need it. I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not one of those people, but I was really willing to try anything to get me out of the pain I was in. I went to Celebrate Recovery alone and totally at my lowest. And it was about 2 weeks after that I started to work a program. Initially, I reached out to someone from recovery and began the conversation of asking them to be my sponsor by saying, I know you're probably too busy to be a sponsor, which looking back now, I know was a way for me to protect myself from rejection. I'm so glad this person saw through my self-protection and called me out on it and was willing to be my sponsor. It was at this point that I started working the steps. Also during this season, I felt as though I'd lost a lot of people who were really close to me. My fear of rejection was amplified, and the pain was absolutely unbearable. I found myself on the floor of a friend's house crying out in pain. I had lost my job, my husband, and so many people I was close to. I had hit rock bottom. It was during this time that my ex asked me for a divorce, and I kept trying to convince him to not go through with it. But soon I felt like the Lord told me I needed to stop trying to control him and change his mind. That if his mind changed, it was going to be because of the Lord, not because I convinced him to stay. So I stopped calling, and I just decided to take care of me. I charged into my recovery. I learned a lot about serenity and how to keep it. I learned that keeping my serenity was going to have to be intentional, and I had to choose to not give it away. I learned that I was responsible for my peace. I also learned a lot about my control issues. First, that I had some. I learned that my perfectionism was driving my control. I was so concerned about being perfect that I would control anything and everyone in my path to make things look perfect. My ex and I came back together at that time, and I didn't want to go back to the old Kasey. I really, really had to work my program. I was able to see how manipulative I was, how I would try to punish him for hurting me, and I started making progress. I learned how to not get on the roller coaster. I had accountability. I joined a step study. I would call my sponsor or accountability partner every time I got triggered. I already had a relationship with Jesus, and he was all I had to cling to during that spiral downward. But my relationship grew with him because of recovery. It was like Jesus got into every crack and crevice of my life. It was amazing. There were parts of me that I didn't even know needed healing. And God used the groups on Monday nights, my sponsor and accountability partners, to show me what's true about me and what's true about Jesus. I didn't share that first time I came to recovery. I think I was worried that everybody was judging me, but I kept coming back, and I took a blue chip for all the things related to my life falling apart. As I was working my program, I was growing with boundaries and health. I started to learn what acceptable behavior was and what was unacceptable for me. In 2018, I had reached my limit for my marriage. I had uncovered some things that were very hurtful, and I wanted to leave, but I didn't feel like God gave me the go-ahead at that point. I felt like God told me to start reading the book of Joshua, so I listened. Because I didn't want to be impulsive and make a rash decision, I didn't leave abruptly. I joined a week-long prayer group and prayed for the redemption of my marriage at that time. I called accountability, my sponsor, and worked a program. One night, after 2 weeks of praying for redemption, God woke me up in the middle of the night to tell me that I didn't need to fight anymore and I could rest from this war. I had so much peace in that moment that I could make the decision to divorce. 2 days later, in reading the book of Joshua, the last verse in Joshua 16 says, "And the land rested from war." I knew in my journaling that God was speaking to me and giving me grace through such a painful moment. I had serenity that only could come from God. It was remarkable. I felt as though God provided everything I needed through the ending of my marriage, from a place to live to the ease of the paperwork. I felt like God was with me through the entire thing. It was one of the most tragic yet peaceful moments of my life. I've had so much gratitude for what God brought me through, even though my marriage ended in divorce. My broken marriage brought me to recovery, and I tell people all the time that I would go through it all again if I could come out as healthy and happy as I am today. After my divorce, I took some time off from dating. I grew in friendships with some of my fellow recovery girls. These friendships are some of the most life-giving and wonderful friendships I have ever had. The time off from dating was full of peace, self-reflection, healing, and goodness, and I would never trade it for anything. In 2019, after my year of singleness, I started to date again and eventually met my now husband. There was a part of me that kept working my program during that time, but I would be lying if I wasn't honest that there was a part of me that went into codependency relapse. I used COVID as an excuse to not completely stay in contact with my community and even cut off some of my most life-giving relationships. I traveled into a shame spiral and secrecy. I had to go back and make amends to those folks that I had hurt during my shame spiral. When I reached out to those ladies, they were there with open arms and met me where I was at. I'm grateful to have a program to work, a community that's willing to love me even when I relapse. But the truth is, I don't have to go into old Kasey behaviors because I have tools to forge a new path. My husband and I got married in 2022, and we started on a journey of trying to get pregnant right away. We were unsuccessful for almost 2 years, and infertility is something that has taught me powerlessness in a whole new way. My infertility pushed me to a place of surrender and pain that I had never known. In light of these challenges, we began IVF. I was in so much fear of the future and really battled with the fear of not feeling good enough. I began to really prioritize my recovery through counseling and reading and book clubs. This season, despite the difficulty, I was able to maintain a healthy space due to working my program. I'm glad to share that we are pregnant with our first child, and he is due in April. Sometimes I notice my complacency in my recovery. And when that happens, I spiral very quickly and retreat to old behaviors. When I am complacent, I can't really work through some of my hurts and hang-ups. I recognize that I still have room for growth in my recovery, but I have also recognized that I can't do this program alone, so I have to be 100% honest with my community. This is an extra layer of accountability for me as I navigate some of the painful issues in my life. My favorite step and the most difficult step for me are one and the same. Step 1, we admitted we were powerless over our addictions and compulsive behaviors, that our lives have become unmanageable. I know that nothing good lives in me, that is, in my sinful nature. This is my favorite step because it's the first step towards healing, and this is the hardest step because I had to admit that I have a problem and I'm not God. Even though I have a tendency to think I can control everything, I couldn't manhandle my life anymore, and that wasn't fun because blaming others was so much easier. Because of my recovery, my relational health has skyrocketed. I've learned to check my motives and not take responsibility for others. I've gotten better at working my tools when I get triggered instead of reacting in an unhealthy way. One of the most influential and powerful tools I have found is the journaling tool. Whether using my daily moral inventory or a situation that has come up, I will ask God the question, what do you have to say to me about, and fill in the blank. It's through this journaling that I hear the voice of God. He teaches me a lot about himself with the tools, as well as a lot about myself. Journaling has impacted me the most. It gives me the space and the opportunity to tune the voice of God into my current circumstance. And while I often want my journaling to be God telling me everything I did right and everything everyone else did wrong, it's not often that. It's usually a process of the Lord showing me sin I never saw, and the Lord navigating difficult, impossible, dangerous conversations. The biggest gift I have received from recovery has been hearing the voice of God in a much clearer way. I could hear God's voice prior to recovery, but it was in my rock bottom when I had nothing else and no one else that God found me and spoke to me loudly. I believe it was through desperation and my reach for God that something clicked in my brain and God's voice became louder. As I continue to grow in my recovery, I can't help but tell others what God has done in my life. I want others to experience the hope that I have found. I am moved by how God changed my life so much because of this program. When I first came to recovery, I was so ashamed of my mess, and I didn't want anyone to know about my baggage. And I find it pretty interesting that God has me here sharing my stuff, and I'm not ashamed anymore, but grateful for what he's brought me from. I want to express my gratitude to those who have walked this journey with me, who stepped into my life and work alongside me in my program. My sponsor who loves me even when I make stupid decisions, my accountability partners who get me a different perspective, my friends and my coworkers who remind me that recovery can be fun, and my husband, who gets to hear all my recovery jargon and tools and how to work a program, and to those who are house me or listen to me cry and offered encouragement. I've learned that life is best done in deep, meaningful, candid relationships. And recovery isn't a me program, it's a we program. And it's through this amazing support system that I'm finding hope. To the newcomer or the person who doesn't think recovery is for them, I encourage you to give the program a shot. Even if your life isn't falling apart, recovery can help you grow to look more like Jesus. Recovery helped me to learn about me and see sin that I didn't even know I was doing. It's a refining process, and recovery has helped me become a better me. I can imagine God wants to do the same for you. Celebrate Recovery has made me become more like Jesus, and for that, I'm eternally grateful. Thanks for letting me share.
Well, I'm Christine, and I am just in awe when I hear a testimony of what God can do when I listen and I do the work. And so by listening to Kasey, how she has done the work, it just, I don't know why, but it still blows my mind that God shows up and still walks us through the process. I loved how her first couple of sentences, she talked about checking the temperature in the room. And I thought one thing that recovery has taught me is how to regulate my own temperature. And when I heard Kasey talking about her rage, and how that temperature can be so high, but working through the steps can help me regulate. And I get to be the one that sets the temperature in the room. And if the temperature isn't to my liking, I can adjust or I can leave. And that is one of the greatest things that I have learned through recovery. One of the things that Kasey mentioned was sponsorship. And how important that is to have somebody walk alongside of you and go through the program. So we know that we don't have a lot of sponsors that are available, but we have some that are available. So I am going to ask if you are willing to step in and help sponsor someone and give back to them what you have been given to by your sponsor. If you would just stand to make yourself. Go ahead. I watch Keith in the back sit back down. All right. Thank you, guys. Look, so we've got 5 people, 6, 7 people, right? So I encourage you guys to really, at Connection Cafe tonight, to step out of your comfort zone, get a phone number, have a conversation. It doesn't mean it has to be your sponsor, but it's a step in the right direction. Because I know for me, if I want something different, I need to do. Oh my gosh, you guys are lame. If I want something different, I need to. So I encourage you guys to step out of your comfort zone and grab a phone number and make some connections. I wanted to also let you know that our rooms tonight, we have open share and chemical dependency for women out this way, and for men, the same groups out that way. And so when we break here, you can head out to those groups, and then afterwards, we will have a time at Connection Cafe where you can grab some phone numbers and get a snack and make some more connections. I also want to let you know that if this is your first time to our recovery program, we are so excited that you are here, and you are a gift to us. And we hope that we have been a gift to you, and we ask that you continue to come back. If this is your home recovery meeting, we ask you to prayerfully consider giving back to the ministry that is given to you. Keeps our lights on, gives us coffee, dessert, all the frills that we see here. Because I've been to some meetings where there's no frills, and I'm super excited to be at a meeting where there are some frills, and it's a place where our church ministry supports us as a ministry of Community of Hope. So I encourage you to do that. You can either do that online, or you can text, or you can meet at the back doors on your way out. Somebody will be back there with a basket. So we are going to get together and stand, and we are going to close with our serenity prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as a pathway to peace, taking as Jesus did, this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that you will make all things right if I surrender to your will, so that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with you forever in the next. Amen. Hope to see you in small group. Our questions are in the app.